Hello, I'm Rod Dreher. I'm here with Metropolitan Hilarion Alfeyev, and we will be talking today about the life of Jesus. Some Vladikas say that we in the West live in a post-Christian era, in the sense that Jesus is not the default setting. Belief in Jesus is not the default setting for Western civilization. Do you believe that the West is post-Christian?
No, I don't think so. I would rather argue that the West is still pre-Christian, because I believe that the spring of Christianity is yet to come. You remember how the Gospel of Matthew finishes by the commandment of Christ given to his disciples, go ye therefore and preach to all nations and baptize them in the name of the Father and of the Son and of the Holy Spirit. But we can see that there are entire nations where the preaching of the gospel has not yet even begun. And so I believe that Christianity has a future also in the West, also in the Western civilization. Of course, if we compare today's times with medieval times or with, let's say, Byzantine era, then we will see obvious differences. But I would argue that Christianity is like a spiral which has very different shapes in different times. There are times when Christianity is being persecuted, and there are times when it is favored by the authorities. But the real essence of Christianity doesn't really depend on these external circumstances.
So a lot of people today are really skeptical about everything, every religious claim. How can we know for sure that Jesus really existed? After all, he left no writings.
Well, there was one Baptist preacher who finally became an atheist and who said that we can only believe that Jesus Christ really existed if we find either his diary or his bones. But of course, there are many historical figures of whom neither diary nor bones have survived. And yet we are pretty sure that they existed. For example, Socrates. We only know about him from the writings of Plato, or Plato himself. There are no his autographs. There are only copies of his writings, which were made many centuries after he died. With Jesus Christ, we have so many witnesses, and they are so close to his time that it is very difficult to doubt that he existed. Of course, one can argue who he was, and there are lots of arguments about him, probably more than about any other historical figure. But to doubt his existence, as did some scholars in the Soviet Russia or in the Third Reich in the 1930s, I think it goes against the obvious. Even if we take the four Gospels as testimonies, we can see that they have all necessary marks of trustworthy testimonies, because they are four, because they are different. They even have some discrepancies among them. There are some ways in which one gospel would differ from another one. And if we look at them together, we can see that they present a full picture of what was happening.
Now, that's really interesting, because some people would say the fact that the Gospels don't line up perfectly in their account of the life of Christ, that shows that they're not trustworthy. But you say, no, actually, that is a point in favor of their credibility.
Yes, that's what I say also in my book. If there is an accident, for example, and the police comes and they ask witnesses what was happening. It is quite obvious that people who were standing in different places would see different things. Some would say, there were two cars, they collided, and there were three people in one car and two people in another car. And some people may have seen it in a different way, and they would even give different figures, because this is how they remembered the story. If the Gospels said exactly the same things on the same topics, this would have meant that these people came together, they discussed what they would say, and then they made sure that their accounts correspond entirely with one another. One can also say that because these Gospel stories circulated within the church could have done it at an early stage. It could have made sure that there are no discrepancies between the Gospel accounts, but it never did so. There were attempts, for example, to make one story of the four Gospels. There was a certain Tatian in the 3rd century who composed the so-called Diatessaron, meaning an account based on the four Gospels. But it was rejected by the church. It was even burned in some places, because the church didn't want to correct what was written by initial witnesses.
So if you accept that Jesus really did exist, why can't you say he was just a wise teacher? Why do you have to believe that he was God?
Because he himself presented himself as God, and the whole meaning of his personality and of his preaching changes drastically if you take something of what he said, but if you reject other aspects of his preaching. And then, of course, you have to a more general point. What was the meaning of his story if he was just a human being? After all, there were many people who were crucified. There were 6,000 people who were crucified after the revolt of Spartacus. The whole Via Appia was full with these crosses, but none of these crosses exercised any similar influence on the humanity compared to the cross of Jesus Christ. One can argue that he was unjustly condemned, but there were many other people who were condemned for no reason. So if you take his story in its different aspects, it only has a truly universal meaning if it is the story of God who became man. And then his sacrifice becomes redemptive for humanity.
You know, we see in church history that the early ecumenical councils were dedicated to defining who Jesus is and who he is not. Why was this important? Why couldn't the council fathers just simply agree to disagree as we do today?
What is interesting about the ecumenical councils is that they always responded to some challenges, the challenges which we now call heresies. And it was because of heresies that some dogmas and some doctrines were formulated. For example, there was one clever man in the late 4th century who decided that he has the best explanation of how human and divine natures coexisted in Jesus Christ. He said, well, his body was human, but his soul was divine. And then there was another man who said, well, actually, we have to think carefully about this explanation, because if it was only human body that God has taken upon himself, it means that only human body was deified by God, but not human soul not human intellect. And then he said it was Gregory the theologian, known as Gregory of Nazianzus in the West. And then he said Jesus Christ was fully human. Therefore, he had human body and human soul and human nous intellect. And there were many other attempts to explain how these two natures coexisted in Jesus Christ. There was Nestorius in the 5th century who said, well, human nature was like a house, and the divinity was living in this house. Again, this was rejected, because in this way he kind of divided Jesus Christ into two persons, into two sons of God.
But I want to press the point just a little bit. We in the modern world, we see so many Christians who believe slightly different things about Jesus and who have no way of reconciling these opinions, and they don't even think it's important to reconcile them. We don't live that way in the Orthodox Church. We believe that orthodoxy, right belief, is important. Why is it important to get these things right about Jesus, about his basic nature?
Because with Jesus Christ and with the Gospels, you can very easily miss the point. And there were many attempts to recreate the Gospel. For example, in the 19th century, there were philosophers who tried to create what they called a religion within the boundaries of reason. And in this way, they had to recreate the Gospel, they had to rewrite it. They deleted everything miraculous from the Gospel, they deleted the resurrection of Christ, and they basically presented Jesus Christ as one of the teachers alongside with Buddha, Confucius, and others. This was also the point of Lev Tolstoy. But if we really want to grasp the essence of Jesus' personality and his teaching, we have to believe what he said, and he never put himself alongside with others, like with the prophets, for example, or with philosophers. He always presented himself as the only begotten Son of God, as the messenger of God, as the one who has the full authority to say, you have heard what was said to the people of old, and now I am saying you.
Next time we come together, we will be talking about this quest for the historical Jesus and this attempt by biblical scholars to reduce Jesus into something that only a quote-unquote rational person can believe. Thank you.